new and exciting. So there'll be more to come on that, as I said, next week, and they'll give you a little bit of background on that, and our board is going to be talking about that tonight as well. And other than that, I'm delighted to have you all here. It's nice to see everyone, some faces I haven't seen in a while. So certainly welcome back to those of you we haven't seen, and to the ones that we have seen last week, welcome back again. That's all I really had. I'd like to turn it over to Dave Barty now, who's going to be kind enough to introduce Ross for us. And we're really excited to hear what you have to say, Ross. Ukraine is a hot topic right now, and I know there's a lot of interest in it. So thanks for joining us today, and over to you, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, and welcome to all Rotarians and our guests, and to our guest speaker, and to her mother, to his mother, to Margot. And I wanted to begin by just reminding everybody that Ross's father was a very strong Rotarian. Ian Reid was for many years a member of the Stokers group, and I have dreams of one of these days we'll persuade Ross to join our group and our club and participate in the tradition that his father followed in for so many years. It's an honor and a privilege to introduce Ross today. Ross is a distinguished public servant. He's worked provincially, nationally, internationally. He was a member of Parliament. He was a member of the Cabinet of Government of Canada. He worked as a deputy minister and a senior advisor in the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. And he's worked extensively in a number of countries around the world. And he's going to tell us about that. But he's been very active in strengthening democratic institutions in a variety of different countries. And so he's doing all this work. And we live in the same building. Ross and I live in the same building here in Pleasantville. And we're parked right next to each other. And and I've known Ross for many, many years. And back when he was working in the Prime Minister's office, he did a big favor for me, which helped me out a lot, and for which I will be eternally grateful. And Ross is a man with a lot of experience in government. He's going to tell us about some hot spots around the world. And as we speak today, we've got big powers that are basically facing off against each other, and consequences could be dire. And we're hopeful that some peace and resolution will be found. But it all comes down to improving our democratic institutions. And with that this introduction, Ross, it's all yours. And we will finish at 2 o'clock. So, and I did in a Pavlovian sense tell you we had 20 minutes because I can't think outside that template, right? I'm in a box where we eat, and then we have a speaker for 20 minutes. But you got more than 20 minutes if you want to use it. And we'll also hopefully have lots of time for questions and answers as long as we get out and finish by 2 o'clock, because Michelle has to leave at that time. So it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for having me. It is an interesting time that we live in. It's a very difficult time. I don't need to tell you. As you look around and you see what's happening in the particular area of Central Europe, we're aware that the Russians have amassed about 120,000 troops on their southern border, the border with Ukraine and in Belarus. We know that their navy is in the Irish Sea. It's also in most sea lanes around the world where energy is involved. They've just brought a number of vessels through the English Channel, interestingly enough, accompanied by European countries. They've just finished a foray into Kazakhstan with some of their allies. That didn't last long, but it lasted long enough to create an obligation for the current rulers of Kazakhstan. There have been visits to Iran. There is a long-time presence in Syria. There have been threats to send missiles and weapons to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. There are a series of very uncomfortable neighbors, not only obviously Ukraine, but the Baltic republics, Romania, Poland. For the first time ever, Finland and Sweden are talking about joining NATO. We've seen, interesting reactions to it all. There's been extended negotiations and between a variety of different countries, and I'll talk more about that in a second. We're also seeing an enhanced propaganda war inside Russia, particularly on television. There's been a pretty brutal denunciation of the UK, the US, Europe, and the European Union. And they are active across Europe as well. What's interesting, though, is that the communications barrage has not been focused on getting Russians ready for war. It's certainly been focused on denouncing others. And of course, we're aware that there are cyber attacks all over the place. So what's all this about? Why is Putin doing this? And I think it's important to start with a recognition that there is not a consensus on what he's up to or what will happen. There's a bit of an emerging consensus, perhaps, on what needs to be done. But in the short term, there are a number of different perspectives on what's happening. Let me identify what I think are the four important ones. One is history and culture. Putin has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical failure of the 20th century. And I think as a very well, highly trained KGB operative, he genuinely believes that. I think when he looked at the Soviet Union having gone and what was left with Russia, an attempt to create a Commonwealth of States that went nowhere, I think he and many others genuinely felt defeated and a great sense of defeat. One of the things that's very powerful coming out of the Soviet Union is this sense of strength and authority that people want to see, that leaders are expected to provide, even at the expense of other things. The second is what Russia considers, or what Putin has articulated as the sovereign right of Russia. And this goes way back to early days. The Kievan Rus, as it was known, the Russian Empire, emerged from Kiev and was centered in Kiev, starting in the 10th century. It was known as Little Russia. Belarus, Ukraine, and to some extent Kazakhstan were always known as the Little Brothers. There are Russian speakers and Russian citizens in Ukraine. This was the rationale for supporting action in the Donetsk Oblast of Eastern Ukraine. It was one of the rationales for taking over Crimea in 2014. Russians generally, unfortunately, it's a generalization, but sadly it's true, have looked down on Ukraine, despite the fact that they were the largest producers of weapons and were the lead in the military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union. They were one of the largest providers of food and agriculture products in the former Soviet Union, but they're still have always been looked down upon. And there's lots of contention over language and religion, and there's no such thing as Ukrainian language, it's just a version of Russian, all of that sort of stuff. The second issue is security. One of the things that I think to keep in mind is that Russia, or Putin fears, and I'm quoting from somebody else here now, Putin fears Western ideas more than he fears guns. And I think we need to keep that in mind. There is a fear of a democratic, independent, and stable Ukraine, as there would be with other republics in the region. Ukraine is strengthening its own identity. It's looking much more to the West and Western Europe. And this is a threat to someone who doesn't particularly believe in democracy and whose own power could be threatened by that. He wants a buffer between Russia and the West. And then there are other issues. Crimea needs water. Crimea doesn't have water. Access to water would help. A connection from that southeast part of Ukraine that we would know as the Donetsk Oblast, over to Russian troops in Moldova would be convenient, but I don't think that's necessarily there, but it's a consideration. Some believe, and I have some sympathy for it, some believe that Putin would be happy to effectively destroy Ukraine, see them as a landlocked country, cut them off not only from the Black Sea, but also from the Danube, which they could well do. The third consideration is the superpower debate and the superpower competition. I think the Russians and Putin want to challenge the US particularly, but also Europe, but US particularly in terms of who is the superpower. Putin believes that right now the West is weak, or the US is weak. It is weak domestically. The divisions that have resulted from the 4 years of the last administration have made it, as we see every day, very difficult to govern, very difficult to get things done. But secondly, America's relationships in Europe and in other parts of the world, but in this case, particularly in Europe, because of of Trump being inclined to denigrate things like NATO, the UN, and the European nations in favor of Putin, has done nothing but play into his hands. Some believe that he is just one of the things, all right. Timing is an issue here because some believe that if they are going to challenge the US, and if they are going to reach an agreement with Putin or with America right now, it has to happen now because Biden has a little bit better control over a Democratic Congress than he would over a Republican Congress. And the Republicans are quite split. You'll see in some of the media today and yesterday conversations about how the right-wing Republican media, led by Fox News, has been taking a pro-Russia stance, but mainstream Republicans are therefore hardened in terms of their position in support of Ukraine. So those divisions create a little bit of a problem. Some believe that what he's really trying to do is to challenge not only the post-1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, but also the system that followed from World War II. Now that's a big statement, and God knows it's a big mission, but there are some that believe that, and that the ultimate goal would be to get the US out of Europe. The fourth thing I think to keep in mind is that he's doing it because he can. He wants to test what he can get away with. If he tests the resolve of the West, small incursion perhaps, and nothing happens, then he can go further. It's worked repeatedly. It worked in 2014 in Crimea. There's the ongoing support for increased autonomy in Donetsk and Luhansk, and that area in the southeast. He's been able essentially to occupy that part of the country. He hasn't done it directly, but proxy. His presence in Georgia, in South Ossetia, his presence in Transnistria, which is a split off part of the Republic of Moldova, his presence in Belarus. I mean, he essentially controls Belarus at this point. His presence in Kazakhstan, even though it was really sort of a long weekend, his ability to resolve the war in Armenia and Azerbaijan, or take credit for that, I think shows that he's prepared to exert himself and to do so with a level of impunity that allows him to embolden himself. So I'm just trying to keep an eye on my stopwatch here. So what can we do? What should we do? And this has obviously been a topic of conversation in the last 2 months, particularly, but certainly in the last 2 or 3 weeks. A couple of things to keep in mind. History has shown us that Putin tends to keep his options open, that he responds to developments as they emerge, that one action creates a reaction, and that dictates his next step. If there is a consensus about the time we're in, particularly amongst Americans and Europeans and Ukrainians, it would be that it's already very late, that the Americans thought that when this arose in last fall and the beginning of the winter, that it would be another one of these flurries, that it would go away quickly, that the US goal was in sense a stable relationship with Russia, not a good one, but a stable one. And that would allow the US to be able to deal with domestic issues and to focus on China. Well, that quite obviously hasn't happened, and is not about to happen. So there is a real frustration in Washington that this has diverted all of its energy and resources to dealing with this issue. The problem with that, frankly, is that that can quite quickly lead to we need to get a resolution, and we may not really care what that resolution is. There has been a commitment that there will be no solution for Ukraine without Ukrainians. And anything that I've encountered, including Zoom calls with the chief of staff to the Prime Minister of Ukraine, that they are, and think tank leaders, that there is a sense that they are being consulted and they're being involved. But there is beginning to emerge a consensus on what they should be doing. The first thing is to shut up. Biden has, as you remember, 10 days ago, made a very serious error by saying, well, if there is a small incursion, we probably won't do anything. Those are my words, and paraphrasing. That immediately evoked a response from the Prime Minister of Ukraine saying, there's no such thing as a small country, there's no such thing as a small incursion. And by the end of, and his press secretary corrected him within an hour, and by the end of the day, the Americans had ramped up pretty substantially. That's only one example. The big example is stop talking about, we can't do this, we don't think our allies will agree to that. We don't want to go down that road. Too much of that is seen as being indecisive and not knowing what you want to do, but more importantly, is telling the Russians exactly what you will and will not do. The second, and the two are important, and this one may be more important. Stop reacting. Stop being responsive to what's happening in Ukraine and take a leadership role. Take the offensive. There are a number of things that you can do. Excuse me. One is show a presence in the region and support your neighbors. As support the neighbors. As I say, there was some perception in Washington that this wasn't really real and not terribly serious. The feeling is very quickly there needs to be weapons provided to the neighbors, including ships in the Baltics. Ships in and around the Baltic states, in the Black Sea, military overflights, financial resources, and other things that will allow those neighbors not only to feel some confidence, but also to develop a sense that they have a capacity to deal with some of these things. We saw 2 weeks ago a big flurry. I think it was the day that Biden made his mistake, a big flurry that the US was getting 8,500 troops ready somewhere in the United States to be engaged as necessary. The United States has 60,000 troops in Europe. All but 6,000 of them are west of Berlin. So instead of talking about 8,500 troops in Fort Bragg or wherever they might be, there are troops that can be mobilized to some extent in Europe. Now, you certainly don't want to frighten the rest of Europe. You don't want to create a situation where Russia has to respond. But at this point, they're running over them. And at this point, Putin is controlling the whole agenda and the debate. But Putin has not been heard from for 2 months, something today. But Putin has been quiet through December and through January. But he still is controlling that agenda. Engage the propaganda fight. Propaganda fight is one way. This is America has caused this situation. America has put Europe on edge. America is the aggressor. Well, NATO has never invaded Russia. Russia has invaded Georgia and it's about to go into Ukraine, has troops in Moldova, is threatening in a whole bunch into Iraq and to some extent Iran. So there needs to be some engagement in that fight. The last thing I'll mention is a belief that don't wait for something to happen to impose sanctions. Begin now to put some sanctions and accountability in place so that so that Putin can see what's coming. So let's just talk briefly about what's ahead, what I think is ahead. And I'll try and clue this up in about 5 minutes. There's lots of talk between the US and Russia. The US, yes, and NATO both yesterday sent back their responses to their homework. I mean, imagine people talking about Russia gave America homework. This is craziness, and talk about losing the agenda and losing the narrative. We've seen France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia meet in what they call the Normandy formulation, I think, something like that. The UN has said Russia needs to pull back. There'll be more of that. What is an invasion? I think in the West, we tend to think that Russia is about to descend with 120,000 troops and take over Ukraine. That's an option, but a pretty poor one. Another option might be that Russia enters Ukraine and takes over parts of it, particularly down the southwest and over towards, down the southeast and over towards Odessa. What we will see, or what we can see short of an invasion, are what they call false flags, where Russians proxies create a situation that might lead to or precipitate some sort of conflict or create reasons why Russia would be justified to go in. You may see small-scale violence, what people will call terrorism, and you may see targeted killings and assassinations. But how does this end? First of all, obviously the West can't be seen to collapse to Russia's demands. Certainly, no more NATO. It can't be part of the discussion. Neither can they totally abandon Ukraine. Remember that NATO and America, and by extension America, have no obligations to Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. If this was going on in the Baltic states, this would be quite different. Well, it wouldn't be going on in the Baltic states because he wouldn't allow it to happen. He'd be afraid of the results. The other thing that you can't do is allow Russia the unfettered control over Eastern Europe and Western Asia that it seeks. It really wants to be able to control all of the former Soviet Union and increasingly parts of what we know as the Warsaw Pact. That's why countries like Romania particularly, but to some extent Bulgaria are concerned. Poland has absolutely no intention of going back. So what are the options? Diplomatic trade-offs. As I say, you can't give in to no NATO in the neighbors. You can't give that much power to Russia in the region, but everybody needs something. Somebody will need something to be able to walk away with. The Russians can walk away with, oh, it was only exercises anyway, we told you that. Second thing is, if there is an invasion, does it follow with sanctions? Sanctions would be direct and specific. The oligarchs hate sanctions. The oligarchs hate instability. I can't think that they're happy with all of this. Look at the Russian stock market. Targeted sanctions against diplomats, business leaders, Putin himself. Can you curb Western investment? It's fascinating how, while all of this is going on, there's all sorts of countries investing in Russia, all sorts of, particularly American, but also European countries and Canadian countries, companies for that matter, investing in Russia and carrying on. In the sanction world, and I don't completely understand this, but it's all about energy. So much of Russia's income comes from particularly natural gas, but also from oil. And there's a new pipeline being developed into Germany, and the Germans are balking a little bit at all of that. But watch energy. It's an important thing. Remember, there's all sorts of pipelines run through Europe, not just the 2 or 3 that we may hear about. The Americans are talking about finding alternative sources of natural gas, particularly for Germany and for other European countries. That's not easy. It's not easy to ship natural gas from the US. It's not easy to do it cheaply, and it's not easy to do it quickly. 7% of the United States oil comes from Russia. Doesn't get mentioned and it carries on, but it's there. So if there is if there is an invasion of some form, you know, do the Americans, does Europe, does NATO get involved through proxy? Remember that Russia has a very strong and modern military. It's not what the military was like even 10 years ago. They are the 3rd largest spender of government resources on military in the world. So that's not to be trifled with. That said, in the long term, can Russia afford the people and the money to sustain a large presence in Ukraine? Unlikely. The other thing is, can Russia sustain body bags? And the view generally is no, they can't. That, you know, we're not going back to Afghanistan in 1986. This is not happening. Neither is long-term engagement on for the US, and the Americans made it clear that it would not engage in the United States or engage its troops in Ukraine. A direct head-to-head conflict, Cold War goes crazy. World War II looks like a pretty minor sort of 4 or 5 year event. We've got all sorts of nuclear weapons running around. I don't think that's on. I don't think anybody else really believes that's on. And the 5th option, if that's 5, is that all of this is bafflegab. And there are a lot of people, including a couple of friends of mine who I trust, who believe that this is going nowhere, that this will fizzle and die, that you got the likes of Johnson in the UK and Macron in France, who are looking at elections. You know, new gas resources for the EU might be a result. That'd be nice. Biden certainly needs a win to help him in his foreign policy, but also just in his popularity in the country. And he needs not to be distracted anymore. Putin flexes his muscle. He can't really afford to go away with nothing, but he doesn't have a public that he's accountable to. It would wound him. And in my view, the biggest winner in all of this, of course, is China, because the US is sucking up its resources. Dealing with this, I mean, I think there is a sense that the Russians wouldn't do anything till after the Olympics anyway, but I don't think that's the issue. The issue is much more if they wanted to, they got mud and winter and stuff to deal with, and all I can think is Napoleon and Hitler, and look what it did for them. So where are we? On one hand, we've got a weak United States, which is vulnerable, and there's no better time for Putin. On the other hand, you've got a Russia that can't afford to sustain an invasion or a long-term presence with sanctions, which will impose serious economic consequences. I asked David to add a comment about other hot spots around the world for one purpose, and that's to remind you that they exist. One of the tragedies in a situation like this is the whole world's focus comes to Ukraine. So the situation in Burkina Faso, the situation in Sudan, the situation in Ethiopia, the situation in Myanmar, all of which are critical to a variety of different degrees, get forgotten. And there's no attention paid to them. And the bad guys continue to pour on the pressure, and it gets worse. What about Taiwan? I mean, is this providing cover for the Chinese in Taiwan? Best example, many of you know I lived in Afghanistan for a while. I still do a lot of work connected to Afghanistan. And as soon as they announced that there would be hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees, which is a wonderful thing, every other refugee in the country sort of had to sit back. There's 450,000 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and they haven't got a chance right now just because the world, for all good reasons, has diverted its attention. So 25 minutes. David, that's not bad. I hope there's questions. I'll attempt to answer them. And if I don't know the answer, I'll tell you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ross. Leon, I think Leon's got his hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself, Leon?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Hi, Ross. Nice to see you again.
How are you, Leon?
I'm good. It's been a few years, my friend. I had a question in not Russia. Just wondering about the Chinese-Russian rails project that they've been, we're working quite quietly on for quite a number of years. They spent untold hundreds of billions of dollars on this and assisting other countries. But I've read some other stuff that's saying, linking this to a Chinese sort of master plan to sort of take over Asia and Eastern Europe, kind of thing. Any thoughts on what's behind all that, what they're doing with all that?
That's a whole other free Rotary lunch. The Silk Road project was designed, as you say, to try and bring together a series of countries around the world. China for years has been going into a variety of countries in need, offering fairly expensive money, but bringing security and investment in infrastructure in return for, as I say, access to big projects. Some of the 20 years ago, there were highways in Pakistan that were like no other. In Sri Lanka, they've invested in 2 ports. Sri Lanka had to miss payments on one of them. They had to hand the port over to the Chinese. So there are huge implications. But one of the things that's important here, Leon, is that quietly, the Chinese have been very active in the economy in Eastern Russia. Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting that they're taking over governments or they're taking over big parts of the economy, but they have an economic presence. And one of the things that the Chinese do that really infuriates governments and locals is that they don't hire locally. So if you go to the port development in Colombo, it's Chinese truck drivers, not just Chinese engineers, but Chinese truck drivers. Same thing's happening in Eastern Russia. So the Chinese—
Same thing in Italy with the clothes making.
Yeah. It's interesting that the Chinese have not really been visible in this till yesterday, when their foreign minister spoke up and said, oh no, we support the Russians. Well, of course they support the Russians. But they don't want the Russians to be, turning it over. China's doing, in their view, doing just fine. They've got lots of fires to fight, but they don't need Putin putting everybody on edge and making it more difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting because they've made some, the scale of some of these projects that they've completed is absolutely amazing. But it's all linked to, like I say, a lot of people think a long-term plan of, economic takeover, basically.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a sidetrack, but I just wanted to ask that question of you, that
My pleasure.
you mentioned China. Thank you.
Ross, does the
Tony.
United States want the Ukraine to be a member of NATO?
NAFO. David, you can't get
I can't get out of it, eh?
Can't get out of it. You're stuck. I bought Ray's book yesterday, by the way. I think everybody's sort of rethinking NATO. One of the things that's fascinating is that Trump denigrates it. Nobody really sort of was running the flag up the pole to save NATO. But the impact of all of this is to do nothing but strengthen NATO. And this has happened before, where NATO was getting a bit moribund and he does some crazy stuff, Crimea, for instance, although they didn't react well. It created a new attraction to NATO. With the Finns and the Swedes expressing interest in joining NATO, that gives it a whole new credibility. Would they go as far as Ukraine? My guess is that they'd rather not have to, because God forbid that it's probably one of the most vulnerable countries, and that they might actually have to follow up. But if it got serious, as I say, they might have to do it. But I think generally they'd rather avoid it, because who's next, And they got enough trouble now. They got Turkey and they got Hungary, and neither is a particularly good partner.
In a nuclear world where Russia has nuclear weapons, is anybody going to take them on regardless of what they do?
Oh, I think that's a very serious consideration. Who's going to do that? Is anybody going to take on the Americans? Not the Americans. Not that the Americans are going to run their nuclear weapons over. The French and the British aren't going to use theirs for Ukraine either, I wouldn't think. But remember that if you do go, this notion of mutually assured destruction is very prominent, very prevalent. Tony.
Thanks. Ross, for George and Dave, I guess I figured out why I wore a tie today. I know I'd be asking Ross a question. So there you go, Ross. I wore a tie for you, Ross.
I slept in that, Tony.
I'm curious. You touched on a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. I'll just look back quick on this. 3 years ago, prior to COVID, I took my family. We all went to Africa, the continent, for a month, and we hopped around 4 countries: Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, and then South Africa. And I was amazed, and Ethiopia. I was amazed at how much Chinese influence there is. And I don't know if it was you or somebody earlier on said how they go in, they develop, they leave, but they own the place. That's their influence. I look at the airports they built and some of the stuff they've done. So I look what's going on, on that continent. You look at what the Americans are doing now in the South China Sea. They've just sent, the Carl Vincent's just gone over there. And unfortunately, that made the news this week, and the Americans are spread that way. The Brits, as you said, are escorting through the English Channel some Russian ships. And while nobody's talked about it, if you look in our own back garden and some of the stuff that's going on up north, the Russians are building up in the Arctic as well. And I guess my question to all of this is that, we've been in a good place for a long time as a country, where we've, in my opinion, we've traded on the horsetails on the coattails of the United States and our other allies. But what can we be doing? I know we've done our little part so far with the Ukraine, but what other sorts of things can we be doing? I know the Arctic is one thing and exerting influence there, but at some point in time, I guess we need to be able to be self-sufficient in some ways as much as possible. Or what are your thoughts around some of that?
Good question, Tony. I think there's a couple of things. One, we need to get re-engaged more seriously with a number of the multilateral organizations. We've had some disasters with the UN. Our last attempt to be elected to the Security Council was a non-starter from the very beginning, and it turned out to serve us not well at all. I'm frustrated by our foreign policy at this point. We're one of the great proponents of COVAX, which was the attempt to bring together a bunch of countries to provide vaccinations around the world for countries that couldn't afford it. What was the first country to take vaccinations from COVAX? Canada. I was humiliated. I was furious. I mean, my friends in Africa and Europe are dying, and we're taking 80 million or whatever the hell it was vaccinations from there.
It is. We've spoken a good speak, and that's where it's ended, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, we've done that. So last week we announced, don't forget, Canada was the first country to recognize Ukraine. Canada has at least 1 million people who identify as Ukrainians, and our deputy prime minister is Ukrainian. In fact, I think her office was in the same courtyard where my house was when I lived there. And we announced that we were going to send $10 million of small arms that we'd purchased for the Kurds, but the Iranians had asked us not to send in 1916. So they've been in lock and key. Well, now we've announced, no, we're going to send non-lethal weapons like, binoculars. They can have my binoculars, for God's sake.
Yeah.
But,
or mine.
Or yours. It frustrates me, but we need to get serious because we could make a difference. But that's a big question, and it's a whole other question. But the Arctic, a lot of what we're doing is denial. I mean, we've done some good things in some ways. I mean, this dispute with Denmark over the island that sits off Greenland.
Yeah.
We invade every 6 months, leave a bottle of rye. They invade and leave a bottle of akavit. It makes the point. Everybody's but that's Denmark. I mean, but the Russian relationship, we have a huge investment there through oil and gas mining, if nothing else. So we need to be prepared to put some behind it. Bruce has a question here. What 3 sanctions would I impose? I think somehow to be able to curb the export of energy would be important. That makes it difficult for Europe, particularly with Nord Stream 2, which is the new to come pipeline, which the Americans had tried to see not built because it goes around Ukraine, and the lack of resources was important. I would target the oligarchs. I would absolutely go after the oligarchs. They're Putin's friends. It's how he's amassed, his billions of dollars in fortune. They're if you could constrain their ability to move money, it's all about moving money. I mean, and money moves large scale, small scale. When I was going back and forth to Eastern Europe, they used to say there was one direct flight from New York to Moscow, and I think it was a Delta flight. And the claim was there was $1 million of cash on that flight, every single flight, going from New York to Moscow and coming back the other way. I mean, and that's just, that's chump change. But I would constrain that if I could do it. The third thing is to try and curb investment from the outside. That's me now, and I'm no expert in all of that stuff. But those are the 3 things that I would do.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, do any other questions? Would anybody like to raise a hand? If not, I'll turn this back to Michelle. This Patrick has got a question.
Question from Ted Rowe.
Given the weakness in the US, which, if anything, will get worse over the next little while, how is Russia going to continue to take advantage if the US continues to get weaker?
That's a good question. My guess is they'd love to play this out. To give them a poke. keep it going. I would think that they wouldn't hesitate to sort of be visible in other places. You know, invite the military from Myanmar and 2 or 3 neighboring countries, perhaps through ASEAN, to come together in Moscow. I mean, I'm pulling these out of my head, but out of my hat. But that sort of stuff, they could get nasty in Georgia again pretty quickly in South Ossetia. They could. I don't know that they could get away with it, but they might be able to try something in Transnistria, which is that little strip of Moldova. They could start moving around the Danube. Remember, the Danube is obviously critical to Europe. But could they start blocking shipping into the Black Sea or around the Black Sea into Odessa and limiting their ability to import that way? You know, if you look at train routes, you know, trains come through Russia or Belarus generally. I mean, I'd have to look again, but as I remember, that's the way we used to have to go. So there's lots of ways they can sort of put pressure on without necessarily expending a lot of money. It would be interesting to see how other countries react. Kazakhstan, as we've seen some pretty serious popular uprising against a long and very corrupt regime. The president of Armenia has just resigned this week. I think that's probably because he's not getting what he wants in terms of authority and power in this position. But Armenia is a very strong Russian ally. The Azeris less so, and of course the tension between those two is pretty strict. The Russians were talking about bringing together a conference of the what they used to call the Soviet Asian states of Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. They could do that. They would rather they didn't. You know, they've been able to sort of build some stability, particularly Uzbekistan. But you know, that sort of stuff just to stir the pot a bit. The question would be how much of the Chinese want to see this happen. You know, Chinese got enough issues. They want to get through the Olympics, obviously, but you know, just let's not make it any worse. Particularly as economies recover. One of the issues that we all need to keep an eye on, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, where are we going with displaced people? Are people going to be displaced in all of this? Are we going to create refugees? Our friends in Eastern Europe, the former members of the former members of the Warsaw Pact, are not keen on refugees. We've seen that with moving into Lithuania. We've seen that with Poland. We've certainly seen that, obviously in Belarus. Romania has made it clear they're not keen on having refugees either, and Hungary is the worst. But so what impact can that have? That'll be interesting to see. It's not really answering your question, but there's lots. The answer is there's a whole bunch of stuff they can do, right? All kinds of.
And Ross, the Russians and the Chinese are, exercising together as well now in the Arabian Sea, right? I mean, there's so many things that are happening. It's
absolutely. But at the same time, I keep having this sense that the Chinese are wary, right? The Chinese just, neither of them, both, put it in positive sense, both of them are very smart. Both of them are very astute. But, I think the Chinese are just worried that the Russians, that Putin could do something not great, not smart. His next term expires in 2024. He'll be 72. Does he sign up for another 6 years, which could be his if he wanted it? The election's not a challenge to him, not a problem at all. So we'll see.
Ted had a question.
Yes, Ross, to take it into a wider worldview, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what's happening with the democracies around the world and the trend towards democracies turning into autocracies.
Well, that's a good question, Ted. I was in Sudan in October. I was there to meet with and work with leaders in the civil society, some of the leaders of the groups that the military groups that had opposed al-Bashir, the disposed 30-year dictator. I was there meeting with a group of leaders from women's groups and youth groups, and also some political party people. The day after the political party people, the coup happened. Now, was it a coup? I suppose it was a coup. There'd been an agreed process put in place that would lead from the removal of al-Bashir to institutions that have been notionally agreed, including a legislature, an executive, that sort of thing. And the military was threatened by that. The military was threatened by two things primarily. There are other personal things, but two things primarily. One is their control over huge parts of the economy, on which a number of they depended on as an institution and a number of them individually, but also that as the country became more democratic, there would be accountability. So there would be demands for transitional justice, there'd be demands for investigations into war crimes and that sort of thing. Situation is very similar in Myanmar. I think the one difference might be that the head of the military in Myanmar saw that the military parties in a free election were losing their position in two subsequent elections, and he wanted to be president. So he ended up with a pretty violent coup that continues. You have a couple of groups that are trying to sort of organize on the side and bring together a variety of disparate groups. But all of that is happening in jungles and in Thailand and in Australia and in the United States and Canada. It's all over the place. I think we're going to continue to see more of it. We've just seen something of a coup in Burkina Faso. That democracy was teetering, but they were trying to rebuild their parliament. An organization that I'm involved in was in there working with them in their parliament. I think the whole world is wondering about this concept of liberal democracies. Look at Hungary, look at Poland, Slovenia, which is a country that is near and dear to my heart. When I was living in Kosovo, I used to go in and out of Slovenia all the time. It was sort of the sensible, dependable part of the former Republic of Yugoslavia. Is now just elected a right-wing government that is certainly illiberal in terms of its approach. I think that will continue, particularly as they look at the United States and see it going to hell in a handbasket. And I know that's a hard statement and probably pejorative, but I think it's the case where we are questioning those institutions. I mean, if the British Prime Minister has to resign next week, if the French president gets defeated in elections this year, by a right-wing government or a right-wing candidate, what does all that mean? And I think it will only feed it, and I think it will only get worse. Now, I would think it would be a good time. COVID has destabilized an awful lot of places. And people can hide behind them. I mean, look at India, the great democracy of Asia, and done really well economically. But I would suggest that Modi is very, very dangerous man in terms of the treatment of Muslims and treatment of minorities generally, the use of Hindutva, it's called Hinduism as a weapon politically, complete disregard for the media, I think he stacks the courts and abuses the courts, but he's our guy, and particularly in a battle with China and Pakistan, when we back him up. You know, I'm not hopeful, Ted. I really am not. And frankly, I sit here as someone who supposedly not only promotes but is active in democratic development. And I think you got to go one little bit at a time. But, you know, I look at the work we're doing in Sudan, that turns into a coup. The work that's going on in Burkina Faso, that turns into a coup. And maybe the message is because they're worried that they know that democracy and democratic institutions can catch on and can get public support and have public support. I think that's certainly the case in Sudan. It's been the case in Myanmar. Myanmar is a bit tricky because there's an inherent anti-Islamic sense right through the country, not just the military, but even sadly with Dasu, Aung San Suu Kyi, and it's tolerated in the country. That's changing with a younger population, but it's there. But I think they fear. That's what Putin's all about. I think he fears a democratic development in Ukraine. He certainly has feared that in Georgia. Georgia's turned out to be not a bad democratic institution. Uzbekistan. I visited Uzbekistan twice to see if we could, you know, to do assessment missions, to see if there was any room or any desire for us to go in or others to go in and support democratic development. And the conclusion was both times, no, forget it. One time I was there and 10 days later, less than a week later, I'm sorry, you know, they blew up the Bank of Uzbekistan. And now it's a country that's doing really well and developed institutions. And the challenge is to try and sort of keep them going. And, you know, it comes and goes a bit and it wavers, but generally they're moving ahead. So there are spots that are encouraging, but, you know, I think there's an awful lot of response back on that, partly because it's been tolerated around the world, partly because it's been seen to work, and partly because they fear it might put them, whoever them are, it's often the military, put them out of business. It's lots of business. Follow the money. Follow the money. It's always about follow the money.
Thanks very much, Ross. Fantastic overview of the big issues in the world today. And we're very fortunate to have you in our midst. And so I'd like to ask everybody to join me in the usual way in expressing our appreciation.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And now I turn it back to Michelle.
Thank you, Ross. It's certainly an eye opener. I do a lot of reading of fiction, and sometimes reality is a little bit more scarier than the fiction that I read. So
I'm glad you can tell the difference.
Yeah, the subtly a very important difference, one might add. Certainly, thanks for joining us today. I think as Rotarians, it's important for us to continue to stay connected, within our own community, but also on a national and an international scale. We're bigger than the little city of St. John's here, and certainly your commentary today certainly reflects that. I think we would all agree that we all need to step back sometimes and think about, you know, how lucky we do have it here, because, you know, that could change on a dime, as I'm sure you've seen in places you've lived and visited and traveled throughout your career. Thank you for just so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and do come back. Our door is always open for you to come back and join us again sometime. I'd like to again, so thank you again. And just a couple of things before I sign off. I'd like to just a couple of reminders I had meant to mention earlier. Go out and buy a donut over the weekend and support Special Olympics. Choose to include all of their proceeds over the weekend is going to go to Special Olympics. As you know, our club has been a really big supporter of Special Olympics over the years. And send me your picture with your donut and I will put it on social media. And if you don't like donuts, buy a box and donate it to somebody else that likes them. Pay it forward. So that's my challenge to all of you. I'm going to take my kids and do that the weekend. So, you know, enjoy that. And every dollar raised for that is going right to Special Olympics for the 41,000 athletes that are in this in Special Olympics, and we want to try and support them where we can. Another couple of items. I did mention the board meeting tonight. Our membership committee as well does have a few new member applications, and we'll be hopefully, we've put off actually doing some of the inductions because we want to do it when we're live and in person again. That's always much nicer than trying to pin somebody over Zoom. I'm not even sure how one would do that. So stay tuned on that. Good things are coming. Our club is growing, and we're attracting some great people. Gail, nice to see you here today. I did see you there earlier. Another thing, somebody asked me about my Christmas lights in the background. So at the beginning of the pandemic, my kids asked me if they could put Christmas lights up in our rec room. And the Christmas lights went up and they haven't come down. So you know what? Do what makes your heart happy, guys, and have a super week. Thanks for joining. See ya.
See ya. Thank you.
Thank you.